Welcome to Drawdown Ignite. From the White House to COP, where does climate policy go from here? My name is Elizabeth Bagley, and I am the managing director here at Project Drawdown, where we work on climate change solutions. It is my pleasure to introduce Dan Jasper. Dan is a senior policy advisor here at Project Drawdown, where he works to bridge the gap between science and policy to advance multidisciplinary solutions for climate change and human well-being. Dan draws from almost 2 decades of international development and government affairs experience to connect climate and development solutions for policymakers and advocates. Dan is calling in from Baku, Azerbaijan, where he's representing Project Drawdown at COP29 right now. Project Drawdown, as many of you may know, is a US-based 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are nonpartisan, we are science-based, and we are committed to stopping climate change. To really dive into the content that Dan is experiencing at COP29 is our Director of Marketing and Communications, Todd Rubold. Todd will be interviewing Dan about domestic and international climate policy, and he'll be asking questions that from our audience. So thank you so much for submitting questions. Thank you, Dan and Todd, for joining us today. I'd love for you to join me on camera. All right, thanks, you guys. Take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome to everyone who's joining us from all around the world. It's amazing to see the audience we have gathered here today. For those of you who are wondering, we're nearing 400 people on this Zoom webinar today from all corners of the world. So thank you for joining us. As Elizabeth mentioned, we're going to talk about everything from international climate policy to what's been happening here in the United States related to climate policy. But first, Dan, welcome. Welcome. You've been away from our team for a while now overseas, and we're going to dive into that in just a second here. But first of all, would love to know a little bit more about what you do at Project Drawdown. Your title is Senior Policy Director, but what does that mean for the folks listening here today?
Yeah, thank you, Todd. And thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction. And quickly, before I answer that, I just want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. I deeply appreciate everybody who's come here to learn more about this. I think, this is a difficult time, and it's so encouraging to see so many people interested in this type of stuff. So I'm going to do my best to answer everybody's questions and to give as best responses as I can. Please give me a little bit of grace. I'm running at maybe about 80% right now. So I'm going to do my best. But to get to your question, Todd, so I'm the Senior Policy Advisor with Project Drawdown, and a lot of my work is to try to basically bridge the wide chasm between the science and the policy, right? So I'm working with the products that we develop here at Project Drawdown to make it digestible and actionable for policymakers and other stakeholders. And then on the other end of that, I'm here in places like COP29 and in these rooms trying to literally pipe in the science into these discussions, because a lot of them kind of get caught in the weeds and the technicalities and frankly the politics of it all. So I'm here to stand by other civil society members and say, hey, we got to get back to the science here. So that's kind of what I'm doing here in this town. And just to kind of give you a sense of what the mood is and what I'm experiencing right now. Right now, it's probably a different atmosphere than what Baku is normally like. It's a little bit quieter. The highways are a bit quiet, and I think that that's kind of unusual for Baku. And I'm going to return to that point in a little bit to talk about a little bit about the different locations that COP goes to. But right now, it's really intense. This is a really intense affair. There's so much going back and forth. I think all of us are underslept, underfed, we're over caffeinated. And it really brings up the question of, is this really how we want to have one of the world's most important conversations in states like this? And I think the answer is probably no. And I think all of you probably agree with that. So I just want to give you some sense of what it's like. But at the end of the day, there is incredible focus here. And I just am really impressed with all the people that come here that genuinely want to see climate action and the way they have not gotten distracted by all these high level things going on. There's so much focus here, and it is a little bit encouraging.
Thanks for that introduction, Dan. So let's start with some of the elephants in the room here. So we just had the US presidential election, a new administration coming to power in January. Argentina stepped away from COP during the first week. Papua New Guinea is not attending, is my understanding. So what's the mood like on the ground at COP? Where does all this where does all of this leave us for this COP? And what does it say about the future of COP going forward?
Yeah, there are definitely elephants in the room. That's no doubt. On one hand, I think there is sort of deep frustration around a lot of this and frankly, exhaustion. At the same time, there's not a lot of surprise. This isn't the first time there have been attacks on multilateralism, and it definitely won't be the last, right? So I don't think anybody's too shocked here. And on the other hand, you have, as I mentioned, an incredible focus on the part of participants who are here, and you also have this dogged determination to make sure that we actually see a legitimate outcome from this COP. So on some level, it's kind of on the high level, but when you get in these rooms, it's not really shaking up the place, right? And I'll point out a couple things. One is that there's 196 countries that are a party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we're talking about three of them. Yes, the United States is a big one. It's got the biggest economy and it's the biggest emitter and has the most historical responsibility here. So it is an important one, but ultimately we are only talking about three. Papua New Guinea has already committed to going COP30, so I think they just wanted to make a point this time, right? The US and Argentina may be different stories, but if I'm being honest, part of me wonders whether or not these conversations could potentially move more smoothly and faster without the participation of the United States. That might sound surprising, but to be honest, the US has not been the most constructive actor in these roles. And man, if I'm being totally honest, it is sometimes a little embarrassing to be in these rooms as a US citizen, given how the United States interacts with this process. And if that sounds surprising to you, I'll just share a quick anecdote. There's midway conversations between cops, and they happen in Bonn, Germany every year. Last time in Bonn, I was there, and a delegate, I won't say which country he was from, but he came up to me and he pointed to the US delegation and he said, look, they're all the same. Under Obama, under Trump, under Biden, they're all the same. And so that gives you some sense of how the US shows up in these multilateral settings. It pains me to say that because we really need the United States to be a part of this. But there might be a bright side here in some of these conversations moving a little bit quicker and some other people taking the mantle here. So I want to give that nuance. I don't think nobody's running around here with their hair on fire saying that end is nigh, right? People will continue. There is momentum.
Before I get to the next question, Dan, I just want to follow up on something you just said. You mentioned that, administrations change, but this individual said it's all the same. What's the same between the delegations that the U.S. is sending to these different COPs?
It's how they're interacting with this process. And I think, to be frank, they often they obstruct a lot of the process. They get caught up in wordsmithing and where's this comma going to be placed. Anytime a low and middle income country raises perhaps an edit or they want something included in a text, the United States is always right there to what's called bracket that text. And that means they're kind of moving to delete it later on. They're saying there's no consensus around this and we want it to go away. And it's pretty, it's not constructive. And so you see that pattern of engagement throughout the administrations, unfortunately.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. Before we get into the specifics around what is actually happening at this COP, and we'll dig into that in just a moment here, I want to share something with you that I read from climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe recently in her LinkedIn newsletter. She's a well-known, noted climate scientist, works at the Nature Conservancy and elsewhere. She wrote that COP29 is underway in Azerbaijan under the cloud of the chief executive being caught promoting fossil fuel deals. At a summit where countries are meant to be discussing how to phase out fossil fuels, badges to attend the meeting are strictly rationed and hard to come by, so it's appalling to hear the host country also provided nearly 123 badges specifically to oil and gas representatives, bringing the total number of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP29 to a stunning 1,770 attendees. For comparison, that's nearly double the number of delegates from the 10 most climate vulnerable nations. So I just have to ask this question of why should we trust this process and what can be done in the future to prevent this from happening? Seems to be a trend we've seen over the last couple COP meetings.
Yeah, she's so right to point that out. And in fact, I knew and heard earlier on from the people who put that out, which I think is the Kick Big Polluters Out campaign, which is a consortium of different NGOs. So we kind of had a sense that this was coming. And it's not shocking because this has happened in past COPs as well. It absolutely undermines the trust and credibility of this process, especially because they're coming on country badges, right? They're coming with country delegations. And you do get the sense sitting in these rooms, I've sort of pontificated on this in the past, that it does sort of feel like sometimes they being the country delegations are more interested in sort of protecting multinational corporations and special interests than they are really about protecting the interests of the people on the planet. And that's unfortunate. So it absolutely undermines the process. I think reform is possible, and not only that, it's necessary at this stage. Earlier, I think last week, we saw a letter from a number of high-level former officials, people like Christiana Figueres and Ban Ki-moon, and they said, look, this isn't working. We need a new process here. And they outlined a number of different steps you could take procedurally to do that. Al Gore actually made a plug to move to a system of 2/3 majority voting system, which would give low and middle income countries more say in this. And I think that's right. And I think it almost kind of a no-brainer, to be quite honest. I would take it even a step further. And I don't know if any of you have read the book Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. But just to give you some background, it's basically Kim Stanley Robinson is a fiction writer, but he's really great at looking at the details and like extrapolating from what is actually happening. And the whole book is predicated on the idea that one of the subsidiary bodies of the UNFCCC is made permanent. And then a member of the press sort of nicknames it the Ministry of the Future. And that's the whole premise for the book. And I remember reading that, and I literally stood up in my chair and I was like, why aren't we doing that? I literally scared my neighbor's dog doing that. But you know, there's common sense approaches here. There's tons of things that we can do. To be quite honest, I don't know how many more cops we can get through without seriously considering reform. I'll just say that I think a lot of people are looking to COP 30 right now for a lot of different issues. One of them really needs to start being reformed, because I don't know how many more we can do without that.
Great. And for those wondering, we're going to talk about U.S. climate policy in just a few minutes here, but I have a couple more questions related to COP first. So this was supposed to be the climate finance COP. So I'm curious, what's happening with climate finance discussions? What are the sticking points that you're seeing? And what are the points of agreement so far around climate finance?
Yeah, so you're right. It is the climate finance COP. That's where everybody's focus is. And honestly, every other conversation that's trying to be had right now, it always comes back to the money, right? So it's like we can't move forward in anything until we get this settled. It does sound like there's been some progress made, and we are expecting to see a draft text drop just in a few hours, I think midnight Baku time. So I'm expecting to wake up and see a little bit more development on this. So it does seem like we will probably see some decision being made here at the end of COP. It may run over in time, maybe into Saturday or Sunday, but I do think now that we will see something. The points of contention, so the big things that people are looking at is, one, how much money, obviously; two, who contributes to this amount of money; and three, something called the quality of the financing, which has to do with how that money is given, right? So first, with regard to how much money, low and middle income countries are asking for trillions. There's a high water mark of 5 trillion. I think it, maybe has been willowed back to maybe a 1.3 trillion kind of mark. Developed countries are saying maybe more in the range of like 200 to 400 billion. So that's a wide chasm between how people are looking at this, right? So we'll probably see something like a layered goal. We'll see something like a core commitment from developed countries. And then we'll also see like an aspirational goal, which may bring in the private sector. That leads me to the next point, which is the contributor base. Developed countries really are pushing this kind of investment goal, and they want to bring in the private sector. But low and middle income countries are saying, look, we need the developed countries to commit to public financing right now, because the private sector is a little bit nebulous. We can't force them to do anything. We need countries to commit to putting that money up. So that's a little bit of a tussle right now. But again, I think they're going to probably try to solve that through the layered goal. And then the third one there is the quality, as I mentioned. And so really what we're looking at is like, is it going to be loans or is it going to be grants? The vast majority of climate financing currently is through loans. Now that's pretty messed up, to be quite frank, because what we have is a situation where low and middle income countries did the least to contribute to this problem. They're experiencing the worst of the impacts. And then they have to go borrow money from rich countries who created this problem at interest rates in order to mitigate, adapt, and account for loss and damage. So we have countries that are actually taking money out of their health and education budgets in order to pay just the interest on these loans. And so this is a very insane situation. And I think that there has been a little bit of a breakthrough. It does sound like that message was starting to get through to developed countries. But again, it's probably going to be layered. And I don't, I'll be frank, it kills me to say this, but I don't think we're going to get rid of the loan structure entirely. But hopefully they do increase grants to some extent.
And how likely do you think it is that the United States will be contributing to this fund? I keep seeing this in the news and I'm really unsure about that. So what's your sense?
Well, to the new climate finance goal, it's worth pointing out that actually the new climate finance goal is meant to basically finance the new NDCs or the new national climate plans. These new national climate plans are now being handed in. They're supposed to be due 9 months before COP30. Okay, so we'll start to see them roll in. And so that really depends on what Biden can get out the door in the meantime and what the next administration does. We've heard that the next administration potentially wants to pull out of the Paris Agreement. So that might basically mean that the US contributes basically nothing going forward. But we do have a couple months here where Biden administration may try to get some money out the door. We'll see.
Okay, good to know. So there was a decision early at COP regarding carbon markets. Can you explain what that was about and why was it so controversial?
There was kind of a big controversy. So really quick, and I'll just point out that I'm not a carbon market specialist. There's people who spend their whole careers in this, so I'm going to not do it justice. But what happened was that there was a decision passed at the open plenary that basically allowed for guidelines for developed countries to purchase carbon credits in low and middle income countries. So basically, a rich country could plant a forest in a low and middle income country and count that towards their emissions reductions. Now, that's not how the science works. These guidelines have been rejected twice before from subsidiary bodies. And then at the opening of this COP, they just kind of slipped it through procedurally under actually the governing body of the Paris Agreement. So there's COP, and then there's a governing body for Paris Agreement, and then there's a governing body for the Kyoto Protocol. So there's kind of layers to this, right? They passed it through the Paris Agreement, which wasn't really supposed to happen that way. It's supposed to go to COP. And so now we have this weird situation where they've been passed, these regulations are kind of out there, but they didn't follow the normal procedure. And so people are a little bit confused. Do we have to follow them? Is there still more to do in terms of the procedure? And then we have this really strange legal argument taking place around which is a higher authority, COP or the Paris Agreement. Now, I'll say I'm not a lawyer, but I've studied international law. I've worked at the UN. It's always been my understanding that COP is the premier top decision-making body for the UNFCCC. I've never heard the argument that Paris is equal to it. So it's a little bit strange to hear developed countries make that argument. And I think really what it was is an attempt to make a deliverable early on in this COP because they weren't quite sure whether or not they'd get this climate finance deal done. So it's a little unfortunate.
I have to just say a side note here, Dan. We're incredibly thankful to have you at Project Drawdown with your deep knowledge and expertise on these topics and for sharing this with us today. It's really, really tremendous. So as you know, Project Drawdown, one of our big focuses right now is around food and agriculture and how climate solutions can be applied to that sector. And I remember at the last COP, there was a lot of talk about, well, at this COP, the current one happening now, we're going to be talking more about food and agriculture as it relates to climate change. Have you seen any of those discussions happening? Any negotiations related to food and ag? Anything positive to report in that space?
Yeah, I wish I had better news on this front. There's kind of two ends to this. There's the negotiation process, and then there are some declarations that are like kind of the subject or the projects of the presidency, if you will. So one thing I did see that I thought was really helpful was a declaration on global methane from landfills. I think that was really important. I think 30 countries so far have signed on to that. So there's some good progress there. In terms of the negotiations, unfortunately, the negotiations here on food and ag have centered entirely on a web portal. And it's the whole conversation has been what's going to be on the menu and like who's going to have access to it? Is it going to use AI? Spoiler alert, not many people are going to use this web portal, and it really pains me to see 2 weeks of precious negotiation time be spent on something like a web portal. And in fact, I was really proud to be sort of in the room with other NGOs, and we kind of pooled our takes on this, and they chimed in. One person could chime in on behalf of all the NGOs, and they said, we need to speed this up. We have more important conversations to do. So they did finalize that, I think, and that is it's encouraging because now at the next COP and the midway discussions, we'll see more substantive discussions, look at things like financing and implementation. And that's where where we will really see progress in the future. So that's encouraging, but unfortunately here at this COP, we haven't really seen much.
Okay. One more COP-related question, then we're going to dive into U.S. climate policy. I'm just curious, what surprised you the most about this COP and the negotiations? I know you've been going night and day. It's been a whirlwind experience. You're exhausted, but what's kind of stood out for you or surprised you so far?
Yeah, I mean, how human all of this is. I mean, when you're sitting in these rooms, what's happening in a lot of cases is they're looking at text on a Word document. And in rooms, suddenly, this delegate didn't get the latest draft and doesn't know what we're talking about. And this delegate got a black and white copy, and the track changes were in color and didn't understand that this is what we're talking about now. And another delegate's in the wrong room. Like, this is all decidedly very human stuff, and I'm not going to blame them personally for it. But we don't have time for this. And it speaks to that earlier point that I made that we really need to create longer spaces for these discussions and ideally a permanent space. The other thing that really surprised me is that there's not the same level of understanding of climate change, even amongst people who are genuinely concerned about climate action. I got a question from a lawyer the other day that asked me, okay, so how much carbon removal is it going to take to fix this? And my heart stopped, like my breath got short. And I thought, oh no, I hope people are really thinking that, because we will not be able to scale it up in time to fix this, right? Sure, maybe it might be useful later on down the line to work with those hard to mitigate sectors, but we can't rely on carbon capture to fix this. So that also surprised me that there is, a difference in understanding between participants.
Great. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about what the election here in the United States means for U.S. climate policy. We surveyed folks, who signed up for today's webinar and asked them what questions they might have. A lot of people had questions about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, what this means under President Trump, what might change, what might not change. A quick anecdote is that I was talking to the owner of a local solar company here in Minnesota just recently, and he was saying that about 60% roughly of IRA funding goes to heavily Republican states where it'd be difficult to pull back those projects now. It'd be difficult to get the Republican votes to pull back on this legislation and this funding. But there seems to be a lot of uncertainty, especially around the Inflation Reduction Act. So maybe we'll start there and we'll broaden out from that point. So how likely do you think it is that the kind of key elements of the IRA stand, or what's the potential timeline of things being clawed back? What's your sense around all of that?
Yeah, a lot of questions around this, and I think people are right to focus in on it. The next administration really did make this a key point in their campaign that they wanted to repeal the IRA. And the person you spoke with in Minnesota is right to point out that a lot of these investments are going into red states. Earlier this year, we saw a group of Republican lawmakers send Speaker Johnson a letter that said, if you're going to repeal the IRA, you need to protect these elements. And these were Republican lawmakers that represented districts and states that were receiving those investments. So to me, that seems to indicate that what we're likely to see is, and don't quote me on this because we don't really know, this is speculative at this point, but probably something like a partial rollback. My guess is that that will be necessary. And I think it's important to remember that the IRA was passed, I think, as a budget resolution, which means that they just need a simple majority to overturn it. And so, unfortunately, a Senate filibuster isn't going to save us at this point. So it looks like, there's not really much stopping it other than the fact that now some Republican lawmakers are invested in those investments, right? What is the timeline for this? It's my understanding that they want to do this through a tax reform piece of legislation. I don't think that that is necessarily pinned to any congressional processes. So they could probably come in with this out of the gate. So my guess is that this would certainly be within the first year, probably within the first 6 months. When would they go into effect? That would be written into the legislation. So I can't speculate on that right now.
Great. So we'll keep an eye on that over the next 6 months and see what happens then. A question from Nancy that came in was, where are there opportunities for progress in terms of climate policy with the incoming administration? Are you seeing any signs of potential progress in this space?
I will be honest, I am deeply skeptical of this next administration and some of the policies that they want to implement. Having had up close and personal experiences with the first Trump administration, I think that sometimes even when the rhetoric starts to sound similar to things that we might want to see, it becomes about the how and really how they go about doing that. One example that comes to mind, it sounds like one big regenerative agriculture farmer might be appointed to the USDA. I actually know this person, I've met him in the past. And he really is sort of his thing is to get rid of all regulations and to do all regenerative agriculture. Project Drawdown has been, made the point that, hey, regenerative agriculture could be useful in specific places, but we can't replace all of our meat consumption with it. So I think we need to be a little bit skeptical at the federal level. Where there will be room for progress is potentially at the state and local level. And I think that that's where a lot of attention is going to be focused on, because that's probably where we'll see some tussles between the federal and the state level, potentially the state level and the local level as well. But really, it's going to be about the state level, I think, in terms of progress for the next 4 years.
I have a question related to that kind of more localized action in just a moment here. But before I jump into that one, I'm wondering, are you seeing signs from COP or elsewhere of other parts of the world starting to step up as climate policy leaders as the US seemingly takes a couple steps back? Are you seeing other places kind of fill that vacuum, or what's your sense so far?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit too early to tell because, the US is still here. The Biden administration is still here. And again, what I said, going back to that point of the focus here, right? And I think everybody's just here in Baku to get done the climate finance deal, and we can worry about the rest later. What I'll say about that is that I think, this does open up the space for countries like China to step up in their leadership role. And I think they would be sort of happy to do so, for better or for worse, right? I also think this might put the EU in a little better of a position. Sometimes the EU can be beholden to US requests and that kind of stuff. So it might detach them from that and allow them to loosen up on in some of the pushback they give low and middle income countries. So those are probably some of the spaces that I'm looking for. But my hope here is that really low and middle income countries and places like small island developing states will get a larger voice here, and there'll be less competition for the microphone, if you will.
Yeah, I saw a report just yesterday on the number of EV chargers and the pace of installation across the EU, and it was just staggering compared to what's happening in the US. So my sense is that the rest of the world is moving ahead quickly, I guess you could say. We also had a lot of people wondering about what could happen more at the local or state level. And so I'll ask this next question, so maybe moving away from policy for just a moment here and taking a look into citizen action for climate. We've had a lot of questions from our attendees about how to take action in their cities and in their towns. Can you give folks some thoughts on how to get started with more local actions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would almost love to sit down with each and every one of you and go through your individual context and give you a little bit more specialized advice. So this will have to be a little bit general. But and I just wrote an article about this as well, and hopefully somebody can put it in the chat, which can go into more detail here. But generally, I'll give two pieces of advice. One, take the long view. We need to have a commitment here. I think climate action and even a commitment to democracy itself is a lifelong commitment, right? It doesn't really depend on who's in the White House. We have to be involved all the time. And I do wonder, would the numbers be the same for this type of webinar had Harris one? I don't know, but my sense is that really people are starting to get the importance of interaction. So take the long view, commit yourself going forward to all of this. Remember that you're capable of change. I get a lot of questions of like, can you really have an impact? And my heart breaks a little bit every time I hear that, because of course you can have an impact. You are already having an impact, right? The question really is it aligned with your values, and how do you amplify it? Right? And I've seen citizens who didn't know their way around Congress get laws passed and get to the White House and actually change policy. So I know that it's possible even at the federal level. Okay, so take those two mindsets. In terms of taking action, even as an individual, if you're just working by yourself, or if you're working with an organization, first define the context of what's going around, right? So we kind of understand what's happening at the federal level and the international level. It's important to understand what's happening at the local level as well. What happened with your local elections? Are there new climate champions? What other issues are big in your area? It's important to just have like the broad strokes. You don't have to be on top of every detail, but understand what else is happening, because one, it's going to allow you to avoid looking tone deaf to hot button issues. It's also going to allow you to identify and build allies and partnerships, right? Folks who may have similar interests, socioeconomics and climate action often intersect, right? So make sure you look who else is active in your community. Okay, so you define the context, and then you set an objective, right? Something that is achievable. Okay, so it's great to have like a North Star. Maybe you want to see more climate action from the US, but then get specific. Like, what are you passionate about, or where is your expertise, or what do you really think is achievable in your community? Is it, protecting against, I think I saw a question about a new coal power plant, right? There it is. That's the thing that you should focus on. What is the really important thing, or something within reach? So maybe it's a regulation you need to overturn, or maybe there's a resolution you need to get passed by your city council, something like that. But make sure it's in reach, right? Then you should decide or figure out who's responsible for this, right? It's not an agency, it's not Congress. There's individuals that are responsible for these decision-making processes, and you should figure out who they are, because you're going to direct all your efforts towards them, right? Okay, so that's the background. And then the meat of your action should focus on what I call the 3 Ps. This is a mnemonic device I made up. There's no real science behind it, but it gives you a sense of like, what are the elements that are going to be required to really make an impact. So the 3 Ps are procedural, political, and press. Okay, so you need a procedural strategy. What is actually going to make the change that you want? Is it getting a resolution passed by the city council? Could you get an executive order from the mayor? Could you get a department agency to just simply change a regulation? Find out what that is, and then ideally have some alternative routes as well. So maybe if you want a resolution passed, you can get elements B and D done by the mayor if that resolution doesn't go anywhere. So have some backup plans as well. And then you want to think about the political strategy, and think about this very in broad terms, right? This is just about in terms of who you're going to build partnerships and allies with. So what's a political strategy? One of the most common and probably important and impactful ways you can do this, it's very easy. Start a phone call with like-minded individuals or organizations. And maybe it's weekly or biweekly or monthly. You share updates. Naturally, over time, you will start to sort of understand where each other are at, what you're capable of, and you'll start to identify different actions you can take together. So really creating space in and of itself is a political strategy, right? And then from there, you can get more complicated in identifying in groups that you want to work with, and maybe caucuses and that kind of stuff. And then the last element,
No, go ahead. Sorry. No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, I'll just wrap up really quick with press. Press is easy, again, take a broad view. And right now you can think of anything in terms of press. Think of a disciplined social media strategy, writing a blog, op-eds, anything. You don't have to get on CNN to have a press strategy. It's really about public education and pressuring lawmakers. So the more visible it is, the better.
And Dan wrote an amazing insights post that we published on our website that has all these points outlined too, that we'll share out with everyone who's attending today, and we'll share in the recap email that we send out with the video recording from today also. We're going to jump into the audience questions from our live audience in just a moment here. There's some great questions coming in. I'm doing some highlighting, some organizing on the background here while we're going through this. But first, I'm going to throw a question to you that came from our online registrations that I was thinking about saving until the end, but I think I'm going to just pitch it your way right now and hope this doesn't catch you off guard a little bit. But we've talked about what's happening at COP, the slowness of the progress there. We've talked about the uncertainty, the pushback against climate policy with the incoming administration here in the United States. So Phil asked a really simple question that I think might be a little bit challenging to answer, though. Is there any hope at all?
Yeah, I saw this question and I thought, honestly, you're probably asking the wrong question, because, I think I posted about this earlier too in the last week. Look, I remember getting the advice that hope is not a strategy, and sometimes hope can be a little bit of a trap because if you're setting your expectations up here and this is where we end up, this is a whole lot of heartbreak, right? So honestly, what I really encourage people to do is understand that you're capable of making impact. Try to assess where your agency is and where you can make that impact and focus on the here and now. The hope, the fear, that's all placed in the future, which you cannot control. So focus on the here and now and what you're capable of achieving. So I don't mean to skirt the question. Of course, there's hope, and of course, there's reasons to be encouraged. I just had a great conversation with a member of the youth delegation from Iraqi Kurdistan today. And the things that this woman was doing is insane. She's making alternative cement, uh, basically materials, right? She's working on drip irrigation. She's working on like 5 or 6 different project drawdown solutions in her community. And she's like maybe 16, 17. And so obviously that stuff is encouraging and it gives you some sense of what we're capable of. So I just really want to make the plug, focus on the here and now, focus on what's within your power, and try not to worry too much about what you can't control.
I really love that response, Dan. And just maybe on a personal note here too, I've dedicated my career, as you have too, to working on these issues, to working on advancing climate solutions, focused on climate change. And there have definitely been moments where you feel like throwing your hands up and saying, okay, the situation is hopeless. I've been there in the past. And this is a moment where it feels like it would be easy to do that. But at the same time, and this is maybe just more personally, I feel more energized than ever. I feel like this is the moment that we need to step up. All of us need to step up in the entire climate community. Everyone is concerned about climate issues. There's going to be a vacuum created that we need to step up and we need to lead. And I think that, I think Project Drawdown is suited for this opportunity right now. I think many of the people who are on this call right now are joining us because they want to know how they can step up too and really make a difference in this moment of uncertainty. So yeah, just a shout out to all of you who are maybe feeling a bit hopeless. I think there is hope as long as we put it into action. So really well said, and thank you, Dan, for that. Okay, back to the COP, getting off my personal soapbox here for a moment. Um, there's a question that came in. What effect will the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement have?
Yeah, well, obviously they're going to be removed from a lot of these conversations here. So, and I did kind of mention up top that there is some possibility that that can move other conversations forward. Now, I also pointed out that there's multiple layers to the treaty bodies. So there's some conversation are they just going to pull out of Paris or are they going to pull out of COP itself? Now, this could be devastating. And so Paris, to be quite honest. I think it'll be very difficult, potentially impossible for the United States to get back into Paris. So what that could mean is that this administration takes their stance. The next administration might just have to be an observer. They might show up with me alongside the NGOs, and they might have to mirror that kind of stuff. It's really difficult for me to tell what that impact would be on negotiations at this point. I just can't speculate right now. So that's kind of the best answer I can give.
Right. And then someone else is wondering, I haven't heard this question asked before, so I'm really curious about this. Is there a way that private citizens can donate to the Green Fund?
The Green Climate Fund?
Green Climate Fund, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. Well, right now we'll probably see again. I mentioned in the climate finance, what we're talking about here is who's contributing, and it does sound like there will be some component for private individual contributions. It's a good. I don't think that they take like just like $5 donations from folks. You could check out their website, but as far as I understand it, you probably have to be pretty well off in order to do that. And I think it's mainly channeled through public financing, but don't quote me on that. Nonetheless, I think what we'll see here is some mechanisms to start being able to do that, basically.
Great. This is another really interesting question that came in from our live audience. We talked earlier about the role of fossil fuel representatives at this year's COP and previous COPs. This person's wondering, do any fossil fuel producers attending COP play a productive role? And and if not, why are they allowed to attend? So are they, what role are they playing in your sense and what from what you're seeing there?
It's a really good question. And it's actually kind of tough to answer, right? Because not all of them are very forthright about who they're representing. one of the things here is that actually businesses aren't supposed to be here. You're not able to get an observer badge as a business. You have to be a nonprofit. So what happens is that these industries find a nonprofit to then go on their badge. And nowadays, I think they have to identify who's sponsoring them and who they're with. Some of them, as I mentioned, are coming on country delegation badges, and that doesn't have the clarifying element. So you don't always know who is a fossil fuel industry representative. I think what we see most often is often in negotiations, often in side events, is what they're doing is presenting false solutions and trying to show up as pretending to be constructive actors. But unfortunately, I think so. It's a bit of a sleight of hand, right? It's more subtle than one might expect. Why are they allowed to attend here is a great question. And this gets back to the reform element, right? Where we do have to start taking this seriously and saying no more. They should not be allowed. There may be a case for allowing CEOs of these fossil fuel companies because in terms of implementation, they're going to need to know some of the engineering about how to phase out fossil fuels, but they should not be running the negotiations. And really, they should be more spoken at than spoken to or speaking, in my opinion.
We talked a moment ago about what President Trump and the new administration might mean for the IRA, for our participation in the U.S. participation in international climate policy. Are there any other places you see the administration having an impact on domestic climate policy? Anything else that should be on folks' radar as they're thinking about where potential rollbacks might be? Anything of that nature that might come to mind for you?
Yeah, thanks for actually bringing this up because I think I meant to mention it earlier. Look, there's a lot of focus on the IRA and all the different elements of the IRA and essentially all the progress that we made in the last 4 years. The incoming administration has made it very clear that they are likely to basically gut a lot of the regulatory agencies, the EPA, USDA, FDA, all of these agencies that I think, frankly, Americans have taken for granted. This is progress that goes back like 50 years at this point, and a lot of that could be rolled back. So as much as I am worried about the IRA, I don't know that that's going to be our biggest concern going forward. I am worried about some of the basic environmental, health and safety standards, human rights, to be quite honest. And one thing that's really on top of my mind is things like food safety standards. We're already having trouble keeping up with that, even with a fully staffed regulatory agency. I think just last week we heard that Lindt chocolate from Switzerland has lead in it, right? And I remember hearing, I think either this year or last year, Quaker Oats actually was laced with forever chemicals, which is owned by PepsiCo and has nothing to do with Quakers, I feel the need to point out. But so we're having trouble with this now. What happens with all of these people get fired, the agencies are moved out of DC? This is where my mind really is. And again, the IRA is important. We got to try to protect what we can, but there may be more imminent concerns.
Someone is wondering, and I think this is probably right up your alley, and I'm sure you have a bunch of resources to share. They're wondering, what are the best places for us to find policy trackers or reporting for climate-related policy at the federal level? What are those news sources that you're going to, or those places you're going to track what's happening with all these different moving pieces at the federal policy level?
Yeah, it's a good question, and unfortunately, we've lost a lot of good aggregators just this year, and I don't know why that is. A couple that come to mind are like Inside Climate News, Carbon Brief. These types of aggregators are really good. I used to read Washington Post had Climate 202, which was wonderful, but unfortunately, they got rid of it. Those are the two that come to mind, and I'm just gonna apologize because I'm a little bit tired. But we'd be happy to follow up with those resources, I think, in the follow-up to this webinar as well.
Okay, that sounds great. A couple of people have asked this question, so I'll pose this from our audience. They're wondering, what do you hope to see from the private sector under the new administration? I know that's a little bit outside of your lane, perhaps, but is there a role for the private sector to play when it comes to influencing federal climate policy? And then also, their second part of the question is, what do investors or philanthropic efforts do you think will be most powerful if the IRA is repealed or other climate policy is repealed at the federal level? So is there a role for the private sector, investors, philanthropists in kind of this space that's happening in DC?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, I think we're going to be looking to the private sector to really hold the line on a lot of this stuff. I mentioned all these regulations going away, but we're going to be looking to the private sector to maintain the standards that we've come to accept, right? And so we do need the private sector to maintain what we've already established as consensus in terms of environmental health and safety standards. So that's going to be really important, I think. In terms of like where investments in philanthropy money should flow, I know my colleagues in the labs department really know a lot more about that than I do. One thing I'll say is that if investments do get taken away, probably in a partial repeal, as I mentioned up top, it'd be good to see investments flow into the elements that did get repealed and perhaps lay off the gas on where investments continue to go forward. We're going to have to wait and see what that looks like, though.
I know you're not a tax professional. You mentioned this earlier, but a lot of people keep asking this question, so I'm going to ask you this one. And personally, I'm wondering about this question too, because we have a solar project underway that's not going to happen until early next year, and now we're wondering about the tax credit. So, folks are wondering, here's the question. If the IRA gets rolled back, what is a realistic timeline for a tax code change? And then they say, for reference, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was a central piece of tax legislation passed by the first Trump administration, became effective in January 2018. Do we think the new administration can go even faster than that? Is there a chance 2025 rebates won't be available? A lot of people have been asking us this question online before the event, during the event. Will the rebates go away right in 2025 as soon as that legislation is signed, if it's signed? Or is there a bit of a lag time that has to happen before tax credits and rebates go away? And again, I know you're not a tax professional, so please feel free to defer this question if you don't know.
Yeah, well, I'll give it a stab. I mean, I think yes, it is difficult to know. It would probably be written into the legislation itself. My sense is that it would be really difficult, if not kind of impossible, to do it in the fiscal year 2025. So it's my guess that the soonest they could come into effect would be 2026, mainly because you'd be messing with the IRS's code, and that you can't do that midway through, as far as I understand it. I could be wrong on that, but I would guess that it would be 2026 at the earliest. Again, don't quote me on that. Check with your tax
Okay,
professionals.
we'll do some research and we'll send that out in the follow-up email if we find an authoritative answer to that question too. Okay, great. We have time for one more question. Then I just want to wrap. Oh, actually, two more questions. I want to ask one more audience question. Then I want to come back to you for closing remarks here. So someone is wondering at COP, were the linkages between food loss and waste and climate change mentioned? Have you heard that discussion come up in the negotiations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have heard that come up not in negotiations, but more in side events, and more in terms of the declarations and the presidency initiatives. There's other presidency initiatives that were started a couple COPs ago that get together ministers to talk about this stuff, and they are addressing that. So it's kind of on the skirts of negotiations, but it hasn't gotten into the meat of things. So basically, it's a voluntary declaration and commitment that are on the part of states, right?
Okay. Want to hear from you final words then. What do you want people to walk away from this discussion with related to the COP negotiations and what's happening in the US in terms of climate policy? So maybe we'll take COP first. What's your big takeaway that you want people to remember when they leave this discussion today?
Well, I think more and more the forefront in my mind is the need for reform. And, I was really surprised. I had a lot of conversations about this, and I was surprised at the reactions I was getting from civil society, because they were basically like, well, we've had 30 of these and, blah, blah, blah. It was basically what I was getting was the sense that civil society is stretched so thin that like taking on this one more task of reforming the entire UNFCCC seemed like a bridge too far. But on the other hand, we have these former officials, we have people like Al Gore talking about this. And so we need to build a steady drumbeat for reform. And so I would say that's kind of my biggest plug right now for folks. At least that's what comes to mind right now.
Great. And how about here in the US? What's your takeaway related to the future of federal climate policy? What's going to happen with the new administration? What do you want folks to be thinking about there?
Well, I mean, I'm so glad that people came. I'm so glad that so many people came, because I think that's a recognition of the fact that you have a say in this. And this is, if you're a US citizen, you have a say in what's going to happen in this country. And I really want to encourage you to make your voice heard. Remember that you have power, and use it. Get involved, start going to town hall meetings, start getting involved in the local level, understand what happens at the state level. The state level is actually really exciting. I worked at the state level a long time ago. One of the most exciting jobs I had. So start to check those things out. Remember how powerful you are. Focus on the here and now. And you know, thank you so much for being wonderful people who care, honestly.
And thank you to you, Dan, for staying up so late in Azerbaijan to be with us here today. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your insights, virtual hand clap from all of us. Really appreciate it. Just want to share a few closing notes with everyone who joined today. First of all, I just want to mention we are in fundraising mode. We're a nonprofit. It's the year-end period for us. And as our executive director wrote recently, regardless of what happens with domestic or international climate policy, we're going to stand up for science and the truth, and we're going to push back against lies and misinformation, and we're going to continue to promote climate solutions around the world. And so if you believe in this work, you believe in what we're doing, if you enjoy webinars like today, please consider supporting Project Drawdown as part of your year-end giving. So thank you once again for everyone who joined today. We'll send out a recording here shortly in the next week or so. And then please join us in December. We'll have an announcement soon for our next Ignite webinar with our Executive Director, Dr. Jonathan Foley, talking about what's next for the organization. We have some exciting new initiatives coming out in the new year, some really urgent initiatives coming out to address climate solutions and help advance climate solutions. So join us for that webinar too. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and take care, Dan. Bye now.